Okay, and so everything's set up. As you can see, this will be the third week in a row in which we're going to talk about what I consider to be, and I think it's quite clear, the most pressing, the most problematic, the most weighty issue in American and world politics right now, which is that we are now entering the beginning of the third week of the American and Israeli war on Iran. That war is widening in several respects. And the Iranian regime seems to be showing resilience, adaptability, and increasingly making its strategy clear. And so I have on the board two images of ships that are in the Strait of Hormuz and are on fire or damaged as a result of Iranian attacks. And when I say Iran's strategy is increasingly clear, we knew this from the very beginning, right? That their strategy would be to first of all make sure that the regime survives, and that does not mean that the regime's military, offensive, defensive, repressive capacities survive intact. But given the imbalance of force in the region, and in particular in Iran itself, the idea that although they might be substantially damaged, they were not going to actually find their regime threatened with revolt or replacement, and that appears to have helped. But in addition to that, now the idea that they are attacking the lifeblood of the global economy, right? And so 20% of fossil fuel comes through the Strait of Hormuz, and effectively Iran has closed the Strait of Hormuz. Its own ships appear to be able to go in and out, but ships from no other country appear to be able to safely navigate it. And so the idea, right, that we have an aerial assault on the Iranian regime on the one hand, and what is sometimes called weaponized interdependence, right, an effort to shut down the supply line of critical fossil fuel to right 20% of the world, 20% of the world's supply. And Paul Krugman did an interesting calculation the other day. So if the supply remains reduced by 20%, let's say for more than another week, it will be the case that a new equilibrium price for oil will have to begin to take hold, right? So we have 20% less supply. Who effectively demands that oil? And so when there's 20% more, it appears that the equilibrium price of oil varies between, say, $65 and $100 a barrel, depending upon a whole bunch of conditions to do with demand and supply and politics. If the supply is 20% less for a sustained period of time, Krugman thinks that the right back of the envelope calculus is that the price of oil will have to go above $200 a barrel, right? And so to put it simply, that almost triples the price of oil from where it was at the beginning of this war and the or right before this war, and the idea that it's not just right that means that we're paying, I don't know, $6 a gallon at the gas tank. Assume that it's actually effectively passed on to consumers in terms of the price of gasoline, but it also means that everything that is either transported using fossil fuel or every product on the global economy that has petroleum product feedstock, that has some component part that is made from petroleum. And so that includes plastics, that includes fertilizers, that includes a large number of electric components, right? And we could keep going, concrete, etc., becomes substantially more expensive. And so this is highly inflationary. And the question then is, does it really last for a month? And I think what we've seen, right? We've got a pledge coming, I think, somewhat equivocally out of the White House and the Pentagon that they will ultimately escort ships through the Strait of Hormuz in order to guarantee their safety. But the latest estimate is that that won't be possible for a month. And when you ask, well, what's the delay? I think there are two aspects to this. The first is that in order for billion-dollar ships, right, our destroyers are extremely expensive ships to build. And of course, there are hundreds or thousands of American sailors on those ships and planes and helicopters and munitions. And so in order for them to safely escort ships through the strait, the Iranian capacity to attack not just the cargo ships, the oil tankers, but also our accompanying vessels has to be substantially degraded. And so the idea that we're still a month away from that, and then let us add, right? We are moving into place slowly but surely, ground troops, and it appears that it's likely that we will not be able to safely escort ships through the Strait of Hormuz or render the Strait of Hormuz safe for the resumption of traffic in the absence of a concerted ground operation in Iran, at least coastal Iran, the area that borders the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf. And so it's not just right that it's going to take another month to get those right, that personnel and that equipment in place. It is also that a substantial degree of greater damage has to be done to Iran and perhaps occupation of a substantial territory within Iran. And to be as clear as possible, that means, right, we're spending, and I believe it's underestimated, let's call it $2 billion a day on this war. But we're also, as we've seen, right, another 6 members of the US military were killed a couple days ago. It now appears perhaps that their fuel refueling plane was shot down, and it wasn't just an in-air accident. So the idea that we will incur substantial further losses of blood and treasure in order to secure the strait is part of the reason that I believe the world oil market is skeptical about the capacity of the United States and its allies to begin to restore the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz. And the result is that we're seeing in futures the beginning of the pricing in of something like Paul Krugman's calculation that oil may have to become 3 times more expensive for, and then we don't know how long. So the idea that this is Iran's response. Iran, of course, has a new leader, Mustafa Khamenei, the now Ayatollah Supreme Leader Khamenei. I'll just say it very quickly, right? He is a hardliner. He is his father's son. He may, in fact, be more hardline than his father. And in his first address, he has made it clear that Iran does not have an interest in surrendering, certainly not unconditional surrender, but also, in fact, has an interest in escalating this war in order to make it as costly and difficult for the United States, in order to at least deter future aggression, right? And so one question here, Iran, I think, has to conclude with they struck after, right, a long negotiation, a negotiated agreement with the United States to not move further on its nuclear weapons program for 15 years, the so-called CPOA agreement that as soon as Donald Trump came into the White House, he shredded, right? And, negotiated for a long time, signed in 2016, destroyed in 2018. How reliable is the United States word in a treaty, right? And so rather than relying on a president who has shown himself willing on two separate occasions to attack Iran in the middle of negotiations and willing to violate a carefully negotiated treaty, Iran needs to not just negotiate a treaty with the United States, but actually to indicate to the United States that any further aggression will be met with sufficient capacity, destruction, harm, that it deters that aggression. And so I do think that this is a different stage in the war. I'll say briefly, I think both the United States and Iran now have clarity about their objectives and their strategy. And the question is, right, which is more likely to blink? The Iranians as their military and their regime capacities continue to be substantially degraded through aerial strikes, and as their population bears the brunt of the suffering that comes with a sustained aerial assault, I think it's clear now that there are thousands of Iranian civilian casualties, including hundreds of children, right? And so I don't know how heavily that weighs on the Iranian regime. To be honest, the I think lesson that it draws from what it is seeing internally over the last couple of weeks and also from conflicts elsewhere in the region is that the more civilian casualties the United States and Israel inflict on Iran, the more support the regime may gather. So from a cold, calculated perspective, that may not be a disincentive for continuing this war for this regime. As opposed to that, right, the question of the degradation of its military capacity, the weakening of its capacity for internal repression, I think those are real costs that the regime has to decide how long it can bear. I showed you a little bit of visual satellite evidence last week that missile factories were destroyed in June of 2025 and completely rebuilt by February of 2026. And so the idea that this is a regime that has a capacity to repair the damage from bombing relatively rapidly, at least to its core military capacities, may also mitigate the need of the regime to negotiate quickly with us. So that's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is what will the closing of the Strait of Hormuz due to, and here I'm going to focus almost exclusively on the United States. It's probably very short-sighted of me to do so, or at least very blinkered of me. But the reason I'm going to focus fairly exclusively on the United States is because ultimately it's going to be Donald Trump who decides whether or not to continue or end this war. And I think he is going to make that calculus on the basis of the extent of the damage to the American economy from the war and what that bodes for his political future, for the success of his administration over the next almost 3 years. And in particular, right, what the implications of Iran's economic warfare, the weaponization of interdependence, will be for the 2026 midterm elections. So let's get into it. I do have on the board, right, the images of the ships and tankers burning and wilting in the aftermath of Iranian attacks in the Strait. And then I, of course, have Mustafa Khamenei, the newly elected supreme leader of Iran. So in the last couple of weeks, I focused primarily on American and Israeli military attacks because they clearly had the initiative in the war. I'm going to focus today more on Iranian attacks. And so attacks of several kinds, right? Attacks on the ships in the Strait of Hormuz and surrounding areas. And I believe 10 ships have now been struck by weapons, drones, missiles, mines in the Strait of Hormuz, and then maybe 3 or 4 others outside of the strait, so that the total number of ships damaged is 16. But I also want to focus on the fact that Iran has engaged in a successful cyber attack on an American company, which indicates perhaps that some of the regime's capacity for this kind of warfare, which is yet a different kind of warfare, cyber warfare, is intact. And then finally, on the attacks on military as well as diplomatic infrastructure in the Middle East. And so I hope you can see it's a little small, but every place there's a yellow or mustard dot on this diagram is where air defense infrastructure has been damaged. And so we spoke in the past about these high altitude aerial defense radar systems, how expensive they are, $300 million to $500 million. And I believe a lot of the damage, right, 2 systems in the UAE, 1 in Qatar, 1 in Bahrain, 1 in Jordan. A lot of the damage is to these kinds of systems. And so we may be talking about billions of dollars of equipment that has been damaged or destroyed. But I also am focusing on the air defense infrastructure for an important reason. And so this is showing daily hit rates in the UAE and Bahrain, I believe. And I think it's a kind of tale of 2 different weapon systems. On the one hand, right, the ballistic missiles, which are in red, their greatest success was on March 5th, where 14% of those systems got through. And very quickly, right, you can see it goes to 0%. And I think that is because the Iranian ballistic missile and their launchers have been so damaged in these attacks that they're not using them anymore. Their supply is diminished. But the yellow mustard line, again, is drone strikes, right? And as you can see, right, this is the rate of success in penetrating the air defenses in the region. The highest rate in the first week of the war was 10 or 11%. Last week, right, we got up to 25, almost 26% success rate. That seems to indicate either that the air defense, right, radar has been damaged, or that perhaps they are running low on the air defense missiles, and so that Iran may be capable of continuing to damage its neighbors. Certainly appears to be capable, until something changes, of closing the Strait of Hormuz. We've heard this address from Mustafa Khomeini, not directly, but the transcripts of it, in which, right, he is belligerent, bellicose, confident, right? And it raises the question, on the one hand, did the Trump administration, and perhaps Israel as well, underestimate Iran's capacity to retaliate? Or, I'm going to get into this in just a moment, overestimate our own capacity to destroy their capacity to retaliate, based on the fact that in the 12-day war in June of 2025, Iran really had very limited retaliatory strikes. Is it the case that we thought that they didn't really have the will or the means to retaliate in a way that would do substantial damage to our allies? And then, on the other hand, does Iran believe it has gained initiative in this war? And so I'll say this very quickly, right? It now has been reported upon by numerous sources that Donald Trump has directed Steve Witkoff, his envoy in the region, to open channels of communication with the Iranian regime to negotiate potential ceasefire in this conflict. And the Iranian regime has at least twice refused to enter those negotiations. And the idea being that Iran is setting preconditions that the Americans are unwilling to meet, and that Iran does not believe that sufficient damage has been done to the United States to deter future attacks, and that it really doesn't trust the United States anymore. I think this is an important indication of the strength of the Iranian regime at the moment in this conflict. So I'm going to shift now to American strategy. And the last couple times we spoke, there was not, I think, a clearly stated rationale for this war, certainly not clear objectives, and a fair bit of equivocation from the president, who seemed to change his messaging quite regularly, almost as if he was shopping to find a justification that might work with the American people, as well as contradictions within the administration between Hegseth and Rubio, or Trump and Hegseth, right? And all of this suggests that perhaps what we now have from the Pentagon is not something that was present at the beginning of this conflict, but has only been generated after the war was launched. Nevertheless, four main objectives, right? To prevent the unique threat of a hostile and fanatical regime like the Islamic Republic, regime that is committed to the destruction of Israel and considers America to be a mortal enemy, to prevent it from acquiring nuclear weapons. And I'll be very quick about this. I don't think that many people in the United States, Israel, or elsewhere think it's a good thing for Iran to have nuclear weapons. I will point out that from an Iranian perspective, they look at, right, the fact that the United States has bombed Iran twice in the last year, and that it has never attacked North Korea. They look at the fact that the parallel here seems to be Ukraine, that gave up its nuclear weapons and then a decade later is being, right, dismembered by the Russians, that they may conclude on the basis of what is happening now that they actually have a more urgent need for nuclear weapons. And so if we fail to remove the regime from power, may actually have done something counterproductive to our own aims. So the aim seems a valid aim. The question of whether or not the means and rationality supports actually launching a war for that aim is, I think, a deeper question. Prevent Iran from developing and deploying sophisticated ballistic missiles. And I think I should add, probably using them, right? And it seems like this is an area where the United States and Israel are clearly succeeding. That flatlining of the Iranian ballistic missile successful attacks on its neighbors seems to suggest that the capacity of Iran to launch ballistic missiles, perhaps its stock of ballistic missiles, has been substantially degraded. I think a week ago there was a report that 93% fewer ballistic missiles being fired by Iran. That seems to indicate that Iran has lost its capacity. Again, short term, long term, does the regime, if it survives, rebuild its capacity and, in fact, maybe become more aggressive about developing, deploying, using ballistic missiles? I think it's important to be able to have the breadth of, right, capacity to see things from the Iranian perspective. And I think from their perspective, they are, right, a Shia regime surrounded by Sunnis, a Persian regime surrounded by Arabs and Turks. They have been subject to a foreign coup, right, engineered by the United States in the 1950s in order to maintain control over their oil. They have been subject to war of aggression by Iraq in the 1980s, and now multiple wars and attacks by Israel and the United States, that they may see themselves in a very different light from the light we see them in, which is as a fanatical, religious, aggressive regime. They may see themselves as simply doing what every government does, which is trying to secure a sufficient defensive capacity to protect themselves. Third, prevent Iran from spreading terror and instability to their neighbors and throughout the world. Again, I think from an American or Israeli perspective, this is a totally legitimate objective. But let me just add, right, and this is the bottom line, right? The fourth objective, change the regime in Iran to one that is less hostile and fanatical in their posture towards us in Israel. And the idea that this might not be the complete toppling of the Islamic Republic. That I think is the clearest objective or most decisive victory, and its replacement by perhaps a more nationalistic, more secular, maybe even a more democratic and accountable government, or alternatively, right, if that can't be accomplished, at least the replacement of the leadership of the Islamic Republic by more pragmatic leaders more willing to negotiate with us, and ultimately who seem to be less hostile to us. And I will just say as directly as possible, I think in a sense the accomplishment of the other three objectives, if they are understood to be long-term objectives, depends fundamentally, basically, on the accomplishment of the fourth objective. And the fourth objective is the objective in which it appears we're having the least success. In many ways, I think the right Islamic Republic may be stronger and more radical in the beginning of the third week of this war than it was prior to the launching of the war. Now, I'll say this very quickly. I like the fact that we have clearly stated objectives in this war. It makes it easy for us to assess how the war is going. It makes it possible to identify both what the right strategy is to accomplish our objectives, and also when those objectives are accomplished, it gives us a clear right timing and sense of when this war might end. Having said all of that, the fact that the objectives were not clearly articulated prior to the war, the fact that it took the better part of 2 weeks for them to be clearly articulated, the fact that while we were waiting for, and I'll just point it out, I think these objectives still remain relatively obscure, right? I don't think the president has given an address in which he has said clearly these are the four things we need to accomplish in order for this war to end. The idea that therefore you have to wonder, is this a post hoc justification? And were these considerations top of the mind when the war was launched? And if not, does that mean that the decision to go to war was made rashly, right? Donald Trump at one point in one of his interactions with the press said he had a feeling that it was time to go to war. The idea that the gravity of the decision to go to war, and I do think it is among the most important and difficult decisions that presidents have to make, because, right, on the one hand, in Churchill's quote, right, if the statesman answers to war fever, he is no longer the master of his own destiny. It unleashes forces that are impossible to predict or control in advance, but also because it is almost certainly the case that lives will be lost. Your own soldiers will perish, but so too will large numbers of the state you attack, including the civilian population. And so the idea that we have a president who did not maybe think carefully about going to war. I wonder how long it takes for that perception to take hold and for it to maybe reveal some aspects of Donald Trump's core approach to leadership that appear to be problematic to his critics, but to reveal this aspect of him to some of his supporters as well. And then I will add, right, the just the number of times, the clarity, the force with which Donald Trump, when campaigning for the presidency in 2016 and in 2024, said that he would not be the kind of president who launched this kind of war, that he was skeptical of regime change, that he was skeptical of democracy promotion, that we have too much work to do at home to waste our treasure, let alone our blood, on these kinds of campaigns. And so the idea that maybe he didn't actually mean it when he was saying that, maybe he was saying what he thought needed to be said in order to get elected, or to put it differently, if he's changed his mind, if he really meant it when he said it, he doesn't understand what he said to the American public in gaining the trust and confidence necessary to become the president to be binding on him. And I go back to the idea that if we look at these right objectives, I don't think any of them says that there is an imminent threat to the United States of immediate hostilities from Iran of a kind that threaten our homeland or our vital strategic interests. This is a war of choice. This is an elective war, not a war of necessity, from a president who told us that he wouldn't engage in such excursions, as he called them last week. How much does this create a sense that Donald Trump has betrayed what he campaigned on? And how many of his supporters actually turn against him as a result? We have Joe Rogan. We have Tucker Carlson. We have Candace Owens. Some of the more influential right-wing media influencers who have major followings in the MAGA circle, indicating that they feel betrayed by Donald Trump. Does that spread to his base? I want to raise now a second question, and it has something to do with what may have been the miscalculation about the strength of the Iranian regime or our capacity to rapidly produce regime change via air power alone. But then it also has something to do with the way in which we're conducting this war. And so I'm going to ask the question, do Trump and Hegseth subscribe to a fantasy about American military might? And that fantasy takes the following form, that the United States has overwhelming military force, and that the reason that we struggled, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan, is because we, quote, tied one hand behind our back through stupid rules of engagement. We limited ourselves in using the overwhelming asymmetrical military advantage we have. And so if we simply abandon our, quote, rules of engagement, if we loosen the norms surrounding our use of force, if, as right Pete Hegseth has put it in various ways, we let our military make up its mind about how much authority it has, how much lethality it will use, how much destruction it will rain down upon Iran, then we can ultimately, finally, use our full and asymmetrical advantage, and we will turn out to be much more powerful than we appeared to be in past wars. And so it's not just that they underestimated the strength of the Iranian regime. If this analysis is correct, I believe they overestimated the strength of the American military. And so I want to say a little bit more about this to set this up. The first thing to note, just very quickly, Operation Epic Fury, right? It sounds like somebody said a bad video game name, and the idea that it also seems to license the taking out, venting our fury, our anger, our aggression on Iran, our right anger at its unwillingness to take seriously our vast military superiority and to bow to the reality, as Donald Trump put it at one point to Volodymyr Zelensky, that they don't have the cards, and so they just have to do what we tell them to do, right? And in the same way that Vladimir Putin has discovered that a smaller country, a country with less military capabilities, can nevertheless make it very difficult on the aggressor. We seem to be discovering, right, that Iran may have a greater staying capacity than we thought. And on the other hand, Epic Fury seems to license the military in maximum destructive capacity. And so I'll start with the idea, right? In the aftermath of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, Congress funded in the military a civilian protection center of excellence. And Pete Hegseth, upon assuming the role of Secretary of Defense, quickly rebranding it the Secretary of War, basically hollowed out that office, fired 90% of its staff. The reason Congress created this agency is because they concluded the military actually had rules of engagement that required that it minimize civilian casualties in Afghanistan and Iraq. The military, in its reports to Congress, indicated that it really did try to follow those rules of engagement, and that the problem that it had that led to, and here I think it needs to be said, hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties in the direct product or aftermath of our attacks on Iraq and Afghanistan, was that the ability of the military to use its intelligence, the intelligence itself, the planning, was not able to fully take into account the potential collateral damage, civilian casualties from these attacks. And so this was the effort of Congress and the military to bolster that capacity. Hegseth, in his memoir, is very clear that he thinks that the reason that he and the unit he commanded was not able to fight effectively in Iraq is because they were restrained by these bad rules of engagement. He blames the JAGs, right? So the lawyers for the military, and the judge advocate general, right? And so the idea that that's just inaccurate, that's just untrue, that the military itself imposed these constraints for reasons of strategy, not for reasons of morality, legality, and honor alone. Frankly, I do think it's a peculiar kind of military leader who views rules that prevent the military from killing civilians as a constraint, as opposed to a matter of honor. But the strategic conclusion, right, was that when you kill civilians, you turn the population against you. And that what you ultimately need to prevail in these kinds of conflicts is not only to damage the regime, but to turn the population against the regime. And the substantial civilian casualties have the opposite effect. So with that in mind, this is what Pete Hegseth has said a couple times over the last couple weeks. We, quote, untie the hands of our warfighters to intimidate, demoralize, hunt, and kill the enemies of our country, no more politically correct and overbearing rules of engagement. I highlight that because it's an ambiguous statement. Does he mean that some of the rules of engagement were politically correct and overbearing? If so, please tell us which ones and how you've revised them. Or does he mean that all rules of engagement are politically correct and overbearing, and therefore there will be no more rules of engagement? I think the broader context supports the second reading because he says, instead, just common sense, maximum lethality, and authority for warfighters. He puts it more concisely and rhymes it: maximum lethality, not tepid legality; violent effect, not politically correct. And I'm going to say this very directly. What does that sound like? It sounds like a rapper thumping their chest. Sorry to my friends who like hip hop. I don't mean to insult you, but the idea, right, that it doesn't sound like serious military strategy. And while this right idea that the American military has untapped capacities that have been stymied by recent rules of engagement, and we're going to get rid of them, and then you'll see how mighty we really are, that this is a proposition that plays well maybe on Fox and maybe in political campaigns catering to what I'm going to call, sorry, insecure masculinity, right? The idea that there are men in America who feel that they're not allowed to be manly enough, and that Pete Hegseth thinks that this is one of the problems with the military. It's lost its warrior ethos, he says, right? But there's really no evidence to support this view, that the reason we didn't do better in Iraq and Afghanistan is because of our rules of engagement just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. And the idea that we're going to do much better once we get rid of those stupid rules of engagement is undercut by the reasoning I just explained, which led the military to adopt these rules not only because law, both domestic and international, require them of us, not only because ethics and morality require that we not target or take out civilians, not only because it's hard to maintain military honor if you see yourself as having killed 170 odd school girls on the first day of the war, but also because it turns the population against you and back in favor of the regime you're trying to dismantle. That seems to be happening in Iran right now. Now, I am completely in the dark on what the civilian casualty toll is in Iran. I just am deeply worried, right, that there are reports coming out of Tehran that it looks like something akin to carpet bombing has occurred there. I don't know if they're credible reports, but we do know from the way in which the Israeli military conducted itself in Gaza, and from what Pete Hegseth is saying, that there may be a considerable relaxation of the rules of engagement on the part of both militaries, and that this may be, in fact, causing high levels of civilian casualty and strengthening the regime. I'm not going to dwell on this. We've talked about this before, but I will just note, right, that it is easier to destroy than rebuild a regime. If our objectives really do require not just degrading Iran's military and offensive capacity, but also regime change, then, right, we need to take seriously the idea that regime change is extraordinarily hard to accomplish via foreign imposed military means. We also need to take seriously the idea that the Iranian regime may be quite strong. And so I'm going to add something new to something I've shared with you last week, which is that the idea that this is a perceived civilizational assault, not just an assault on the regime, but an assault on Iranian and Persian civilization that is akin to a conquest, that is likely to produce a kind of nationalistic rally around the flag support for the regime. If Iranians conclude, right, that the Israelis and the Americans first killed their leader on the first day of war, second of all, threatened to dismember their society by arming the Kurds to create an autonomous state out of what is currently Iranian territory. If it appears that there's a religious dimension to this, that a Christian nation and a Jewish nation are attacking an Islamic nation, and please note, right, it doesn't help when Pete Hegseth quotes Christian scripture at the end of a press conference to right, justify the war. And then when, I'm sorry, I think my slide cut off here, there's destruction of precious cultural heritage sites in Iran. These are the kinds of things that are likely to strengthen this regime. And in ways that we've talked about, this regime has not just a military and a police, but a paramilitary foundation. And the paramilitary is very strong, very well funded, built out of kleptocracy, and therefore motivated to fight, to survive, to maintain its privilege and its wealth, willing to turn its violence against the Iranian people. And then if we add, right, the Iranian people may be led to support their regime as the only regime capable of supporting or protecting them from foreign aggression. But the Iranian people may also just do a cold, calculated, strategic analysis and say, if we turn against our regime, what is likely to happen? Is it likely to be a better regime? Will be quickly in place? Or as opposed to that, when we look at what has happened to our neighbors, when we look at what's happened to Syria or Iraq or Libya, do we do a body count? Hundreds of thousands of deaths as a result of failed efforts at regime change. At the regime change results in civil war. It results in insurgency. It results in failed regime. Maybe there's something worse than the level of repression we're currently suffering. All right. So with that in mind, I turn now to Iran's strategy, and I'll be relatively quick about this. I think it's relatively straightforward. The question is, how likely is it to succeed? And their strategy, right, is to counter overwhelming military superiority, not with direct, right, battle, but instead by disrupting the oil supply. This is the largest disruption in the history of, right, modern interdependent economies. To put it in comparative perspective, during the OPEC oil embargo of the first half of the 1970s, OPEC cut off 7% of the world's oil supply. Right now, we have Iran cutting off 20%. We see the price of oil in the US and internationally, and gas all spiking in the aftermath of this war. And just to point out the obvious, right, the US produces enough oil to export it, right? It's not the case that we are directly dependent on oil from the Gulf, but because we have a global oil market, because we have private for-profit oil companies that are not controlled by the state producing our oil, they are going to respond to the global price of oil and pass that expense along to the American people. The result is that poly market, right, when one of the prediction markets that people bet on, where oil executives are probably placing bets right now, predicts that by the end of March, the price of gasoline in the United States will be somewhere between $4.50 and $5 a gallon, right? So a substantial increase in the price of gas that takes it, frankly, almost as high as it was in the really bad inflation that resulted, or the really bad inflation of gas prices that resulted from Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And I think that this diagram from Larry Summers, right now disgraced, but nevertheless a very good, very interesting economist, is important. It overlays two historical periods, right? The period from 1966 to 1982 is the blue line, right? And the mustard line, I guess I'll call it, is from 2013 to 2023. And so this is consumer price index, a measure of inflation, right? And as you can see, that there are striking parallels between what was happening from the late mid 1960s to the mid 1970s and what has happened over the last decade in terms of inflation. And the reason Summers publishes these overlapping timelines is to indicate, look, if in 1975-76 you thought inflation had been conquered, it came back down under 3%, boy, were you wrong, right? It turns out, right, that the worst of inflation was still to come. And so is there any reason for us to believe in 2026 that the worst of inflation isn't still to come? And then we notice how inflationary, right, the surge in oil prices will be. We notice that our limited means of addressing this, right? And so please note that the International Energy Association agreed to release 400 million barrels of oil from its strategic reserves last week, and that drove prices down for a couple hours, and they bounced right back up. And I think the reason there is because when you recognize, right, 400 million barrels sounds like a lot, but it's actually the amount that comes to the Strait of Hormuz in about 20 days, right? And so, by the way, right, there is only 1.2 billion barrels in reserve in total, right, in all of the countries that constitute the International Energy Association, and they're not going to completely deplete their strategic reserves. So having done this once, they may not be able to do it again. Iran may be able to choke the strait for much longer than that. So this is, right, economic war, what's sometimes called weaponized interdependence. And I have some diagrams on the board just to put this in a little bit of context, right? The diagram that shows you that, right, for goods that cannot be globalized, inflation has been punishing for the last 20 years. For goods that can be produced elsewhere than in the United States or high wage economies, their prices have stayed near exactly the same or actually been reduced. So we are highly dependent on a global economy, which is highly dependent on the price of oil, right? And so the idea that, right, from the outbreak of COVID to the outbreak of the Ukraine war, we saw inflation caused by supply chains and then caused primarily by energy sector increases in cost caused by Putin's war and the resulting sanctions, and that actually the worst inflation over the 4-year period of COVID, right, was not from supply chains, but from oil. And that at the peak of inflation, it was costing American households $5,200 more a year to pay the cost of inflation. This is a substantial threat to our economy. And it's a threat to fertilizer, it's a threat to gasoline, it's a threat to plastics, precision instruments, machinery, electrical parts, electrical components, all of these depend upon the direct input of petroleum products in their manufacturing. And so the idea that though the American economy is much less dependent on oil or petroleum than we used to be, the idea that 80% of our new power generation comes from renewables or is expected to come from renewables soon, the idea that the administration is at war with renewables but nevertheless benefiting from renewables means that the United States is much less at risk in terms of energy imports than many other countries in the world. We're much less reliant on natural gas being exported to us. But please note, because it's a global economy, we will still pay the price that the market will dictate for our oil. So this then boils down one final consideration to politics. How long will Donald Trump be willing to bear the cost of inflation, right? And that, of course, occurs in the context of a buildup to midterm elections in which the control of Congress is at, right, is the fundamental stakes. And Donald Trump's perception, and I think it's an accurate perception, that if the Democrats gain control of the House, they're likely to investigate his administration. They're likely to find corruption and criminality. They're likely to impeach him again. And by the way, although it seems unlikely that the Democrats are going to gain control of the Senate, and certainly unlikely that they're going to gain sufficient control of the Senate to be able to convict Donald Trump, if Donald Trump becomes a very unpopular president, if in particular he's already damaged the Republicans substantially in the 2026 election, it is possible that a sufficient number of Republicans will want to distance themselves from Donald Trump in order to survive, right? The next election and the election after that, that they will in fact vote to convict Donald Trump. So I do think Donald Trump really is calculating about his own political life in calculating how long does he keep this war going. On some calculations, 27% of the American public support the war. On some calculations, 41% support the war. If it's 41 and not 27, it's still the least popular war really of the last 100 years. And please note that the tendency is for wars to become less popular over time. This war starts out deeply unpopular to begin with. By the way, this is a little catty, but I think it's worth noting that, right, a majority of Americans in one poll believe that one of the factors that led Donald Trump to declare war, to go to war against Iran, not to declare war, sorry, is an effort to distract from the Epstein files, right? And I think more tellingly, I suspect many Americans think that Donald Trump has gone to war to distract from the limitations of his domestic policies. This is not fracturing the MAGA coalition deeply yet. 13% of Republicans disapprove of this war, 77% approve of it, 10% are not yet decided about it. But I will just point out, losing 13% of your voters is certainly enough to create really powerful headwinds as we go into the midterm elections. It was already the case, and I don't think this data really reflects what has happened as a result of this war, that the Democrats had a sizable lead in the generic ballot, that it was an uphill battle to retake the Senate, right? They've got to win Georgia, North Carolina, Maine, and Michigan, and then flip one of these states, Texas, right, Nebraska, Iowa, or Montana, that seems like a very improbable, very narrow road to regaining control of the Senate, but very likely that they're going to regain control of the House. And please note, right, Donald Trump's approval rating has been driven down by this war and is likely to continue to be driven down if this war appears to be growing in scope, if it appears to be growing in cost to us in terms of treasure and blood, if the only way to open the Strait of Hormuz is to launch a ground war, if leaving the Strait of Hormuz closed is going to contribute to substantial inflation, in each of those right scenarios, the likelihood that this war is going to become less popular seems to be very much looming in the calculus of Donald Trump in an election year. All right, I will stop there. I obviously shared a variety of perspectives with you. I certainly don't want to lose track of the idea that Hegseth and Trump may have completely misunderstood the relationship between rules of engagement and the effectiveness of the American military. I think that's a really important thing for us to be thinking through. Happy to take your thoughts, and I can see Anne. Go ahead. You're muted right now, Anne.
Yeah, the thing that I find so disturbing and disgusting in a way is anytime I see Hegseth or he opens his mouth, he is still sitting in front of his small video somewhere playing a war game on television. I mean, on a video game. He cannot get out, to me, he cannot get out of that mentality. He's gleeful. Kill as many as you can. And then last night he talked about hold no quarter. It's really getting out of hand. So
Yeah.
it's just, to me, very, very disturbing.
So I don't know if anybody saw Colin Jost's impression of Pete Hegseth on Saturday Night Live on the cold open last week, but he did a very effective, caricature of this man who, and I'll put it slightly differently, seems to be just so preening and vain, right? He's kicked the photographers out of the Pentagon because they took unflattering pictures of him. He always has this, peculiar hairdo. He spends a lot of time working on his body. He was a Fox News commentator. And the idea that this is the man that Donald Trump puts in charge of the military, I think betrays a kind of vanity, a kind of perform for, and you can say the video game, I might say the social media camera, right? But the idea that this is not a man with deep military experience, to say the least, or who is a gifted strategic thinker, that he is someone who poses and postures and cares more about appearance and appears to confuse, right, violence and intimidation with strategy and strength. Yes, I do think the association of Donald Trump with Pete Hegseth may be damaging for Donald Trump, as the association with Kristi Noem became damaging for him. Yeah, thank you. And did you want to follow up?
No.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else for today? I'm going to talk about those wars, those rules of engagement for 10 more seconds. And so I guess I've been studying this stuff and thinking about this stuff for over 30 years now. And I have to say, when I began doing political theory and philosophy, the idea that we were evolving institutions that finally didn't treat war as the place where there is no morality, right? The classic description of war as the place where the right powerful do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, um, had been replaced, right? We were holding war criminals to account in the former Yugoslavia, in the Sudan, in Nazi Germany a generation earlier, and that there seemed to be some momentum in the direction of developing powerful institutions to require that war not be what it had been for most of human history, seemed to be a remarkable sign of moral progress. And the idea that now the country perhaps most responsible for those advances is completely abandoning that trajectory and totally reversing course, I just find to be deeply painful, uh, disheartening. And I do think that this is one of those cases where it's harder to make progress than it is to undo it. And so I'm really worried about this at a moral level, in addition to at a strategic level, and the idea that maybe we went to war because we thought that morality was weakness, right? That we had greater strength if we would only unleash our troops is just deeply disconcerting. I don't know how much it actually takes hold in American public opinion or politics or has an impact on this election, but I just find it deeply troubling. All right, guys. So is there anything else for today? Flossie, are you saying goodbye or are you raising your hand? And it looks like somebody else might be raising their hand. Feel free to unmute yourself. Flossie, you're not unmuted yet.
Now,
There you go. You got it. Yes.
what worries me is something like the increase I'm observing in painkillers. Now,
Mm.
the painkillers for people like me, as we grow older, we have arthritis, all kinds of things. But what worries me is that so many of the 16 and 17-year-olds are looking at ways to turn off again. It reminds me a little bit of our generation when the kids used to be flat out on Telegraph Avenue. They want to be left alone. They insist they want to do their own thinking. But I have also noticed that in the pharmacy, the pharmaceuticals, the price of these drugs, any kind of drug that turns you off or deadens pain is going up. That's a little bit scary, I think.
Yeah, interesting, Flossie. I have no evidence. I haven't done any research on this. My impression from my students is not comporting with what you're saying, but obviously that's a very small sample that I have as well. But yeah, it comes back. If you remember, we were talking about abundance and affordability and well-being several weeks ago before all this broke out, and the idea that there might be a well-being crisis in the United States despite all of our material wealth. Yeah, I do think, in a sense, if you're a young person and you're looking at our country and you're seeing AI hollow out jobs that you thought you were going to get, you're seeing the signs that the environmental crisis that everybody has predicted is beginning to actually manifest, that you're seeing very little capacity of your government to solve problems, there are good reasons to maybe search for some way to escape. I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but yeah,
Sally Hendrickson.
say it again.
Sally.
Oh, Sally, I'm sorry. With the angle, I'm not recognizing you. Hi, Sally.
That's
Go ahead.
hi. David, I just wondered, is there anyone among the current military or retired military that you carefully listen to get any sense of where the military posture might be in all of this?
Yeah, I'm not, I don't think I've got a good name for you. And so this is not my specialty. Um, I read a number of sources, and I'm looking for someone, as I talk with you. I don't think I'm going to come up with him, but let me see if I can. Um, no, so there's someone who's come across my consciousness, but I haven't paid a lot of attention to, whose name I'm not coming up with quickly. But I do, read a lot, right? And so I'm reading some of the British press, I'm reading a lot of the American press, I'm reading foreign affairs, etc. And I'm hearing military officials interviewed. And I'm hearing a lot of skepticism about the planning process coming out of the White House and the Pentagon, and a lot of concern that the rapid remaking of the command structure in the military has weakened the capacity of the military to function independently from the current administration, right? And,
Right.
and so one of the things I think we pride ourselves in is having a military that is not only nonpartisan, but independent and capable of saying
Right.
to the president, that's a good idea, that's a bad idea, here are some plans, but please don't actually do it, right? And that one of the things Donald Trump directed Pete Hegseth to do, one of the reasons he chose Pete Hegseth
Right.
to head the civilian control of the military, is because he thought, right, that the military had resisted him. And
Mhm.
he thinks very much personalistically. Either you do what I tell you to do, or you are disobedient. I am the
Yeah.
president, and everybody in the executive branch has to do what the president tells them to do. The theory of the unitary executive that he subscribes to suggests personalistic control. That's fundamentally at odds with the idea of a professional, independent, non-political military. And Donald Trump has made it a mission in his second term to undo the independence of the leadership of the military. So that is the impression I'm getting from what I'm reading. But no, I don't have anybody specific to cite.
And what you're also saying, though, is that he's been successful in being able to accomplish that, that the military rules have not prevented his ability to diminish that structure to his own liking.
Yeah, that's my understanding, and so I'll say just a couple things very quickly, right? On the one hand, right, um, the theory of the unitary executive seems to be one that the Supreme Court has a fair bit of sympathy with, and
Mm.
so there have been some lawsuits to challenge some of the firings, but for the most part, they've been upheld very often on the so-called shadow or emergency docket. On the other hand, and I think this is extremely important as well, that what sustains the rule of law, and so I'm going to take this as one face of the rule of law, right? That we have a military that follows the orders, the rules, the law that structure it, is not the law itself. It is fidelity to the law
Right.
on the part of the people in power, right? It is um, the stuff of norms and principles as much as the stuff of laws. And when you put in place, right, Secretary of War who does not subscribe to the idea of the rule of law, who thinks that that is a sign of weakness, when the commander in chief is also of that view, then sooner or later you're going to succeed in replacing the people who stand up for the old values with people who comport with the values of the president of the United States. And so I do think that in a sense, the independence of the military is substantially diminished. And that this is a concern not only for what it's doing in Iran, but also for the potential for it to be employed domestically. Right. And I just think we have to be honest about what a non-independent military means in the context of a democracy with a leader with autocratic self-understanding and ambition. So yeah, I think that's a really good question, Sally. Thank you for getting us to that dimension of it as well.
Terrifying answer.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, should we conclude by going back to talking about the weather?
I think
I
so.
am going to let you go. I am not happy to have to talk about such dark topics with you guys, but I do, as always, find these conversations to be meaningful, to be important, to be sustaining. Thank you for being with me again on another Saturday morning as we continue to watch all of the news unfold and think about it together. Chins up, be well. Look forward to seeing you next Saturday. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, David.
for being
Thank
real.
you, David.
Take care, guys. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.